Okay. Hello, and welcome to the fourth webinar as part of the Seabed Habitats Seminar Series. The fourth seminar is on seagrasses by Georgie Ball. Georgie is the British and Irish underwater photography champion of 2020 and is a student of marine biology and coastal ecology at the University of Plymouth. Georgie will be talking about seagrasses as part of Seagrass Awareness Month, which is this March. So, as part of this month, a range of events have been taking place to celebrate these important primary producers of the sea. Georgie and I met on Twitter, where she had made a thread to celebrate these important flowering plants of the sea. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Georgie Ball.
Yeah. Thank you. And thank you for the great introduction as well. And thank you to everyone that's tuned in. I'm really excited to be talking to you today and basically just sharing my perspective on seagrasses as a photographer and also a budding scientist. So I'll crack on. Basically, the main point of this really is to introduce people to seagrasses as a habitat. And I'm going to take quite a basic level at the start because I don't want to assume any sort of expertise or knowledge and try and make this as accessible as possible. Sorry, there we go. I'll start off just by introducing what topics I'll be covering. So I'm just going to briefly introduce myself. I've already had somewhat of a great introduction, but just to give you an idea of the perspective I'm approaching this topic with. And then I'll go into seagrass biology and ecology, just to introduce you to what seagrasses really are and whereabouts they're distributed on the globe. And then talk about what seagrasses offer us. They're an amazing example of a habitat that not only provide for nature, but also provide an amazing array of services for humans too. And then I'm going to kind of mold my interest in science with my love of photography and talk about the public's perception of seagrass, because there's been some really interesting work done on this. And I will confess it will have more of a British or UK perspective, just because that's what I'm most familiar with. But I think the lessons from that can be broadly applied to your local area or wherever you are on the globe, really. They're important lessons to learn about conservation. And then look into the threats to seagrass as well, and finishing up with the bigger picture. So how our knowledge of seagrass, our knowledge of what people think about seagrass, and our knowledge about the threats to seagrass can empower us to conserve them in the future. So I thought I'd just briefly introduce myself. As mentioned, I'm a undergraduate marine biology and coastal ecology student at the University of Plymouth. But I'm also a commercial and recreational diver. So both of those photos on the left there are me, and I've pretty much always got a camera in my hand. And I think this gives me a kind of unique perspective, because a lot of the fundamental ecological principles that I've been taught on my course have been taught from the perspective of seagrass, whether it be why and how they make a fantastic habitat, or exploring some of the local seagrass beds to me as a photographer or as a surveyor. So I've kind of got this nice mix of ecological understanding, but a real personal connection to the habitat as well. So to start off, I wanted to kind of explain what seagrass is, and that might sound a bit strange, but I think it's important to kind of place what we're talking about here, because seagrasses superficially are quite similar to some of the other photosynthetic organisms we have in the sea, like seaweeds. But seagrasses are different in the sense that they are true flowering plants, which are called angiosperms. And this means that they complete their whole life cycle underwater, both flowering, pollination, everything is conducted underwater. And one of the most interesting things, I think, is that they recolonize the ocean. 70 to 100 million years ago, and this has happened multiple times. So it's obviously something that works. It's a life cycle that works, as it's happened with multiple times in the fossil record. And there are approximately 70 species worldwide. Different sources say different numbers, anywhere between 60 and 70. So they're quite a diverse group. Okay, so with seagrass, this is a photo I took in Weymouth, and I think it kind of illustrates the point perfectly, that they do look quite similar in the sense that they are photosynthetic organisms and they have quite a leafy appearance. But the seaweeds on the left that you see are a type of shoreline seaweed. One of them is Sargassum muticum. It's an invasive. It's very pretty. But they're fundamentally different because they have different cell structures, and plants also have a vascular system. So they have tissues that help transport water and nutrients. In all honesty, the way that scientists categorize algae and seagrass and seaweeds generally could be a whole talk. It's quite complicated, and taxonomists are ever changing what they think. But I thought I'd just break it down to what you would be able to notice in the field if you were to see a seagrass or a seaweed. And so on the left we have a shoreline seaweed, and they're quite rubbery in texture, and they have blades and gas. Some species have gas bladders, and they have an anchor that is known as a holdfast, and it's not like a root. It doesn't uptake nutrients. It simply helps them attach to the seabed. Whereas seagrasses look very similar to a grass. At certain times of the year, they have flowers and they have seeds, and the exact appearance of those varies depending on the species. And they also have a very thick, true root system. If you've ever had an allotment and you've been digging in the soil and you've had to deal with some of the grasses, they have very stubborn root systems because they have thick rhizomes that connect one another. And seagrass beds are exactly the same. They are they're connected by a very dense root system. So I thought it might be fun. This is an explanation that one of my undergraduate lecturers gave to me when they were talking about seaweeds, actually. And I thought it was a really fun example that kind of puts into perspective how different seagrasses are to seaweeds. So the green represents seagrass on the multicellular organism tree of life. So all of these little white branches represent different lineages of different types of organisms. And if they're closer together, that means they're more closely related. So the green point here is where seagrasses lie. They're within the kind of plant group. Whereas the blue represents the kind of fucoid and sargassum type shoreline seaweeds. So they're quite far away. So by comparison, the yellow represents this mushroom here that I found on a spring walk, autumn walk last year. And the grey represents us. So actually, we share more in common with mushrooms than seagrasses do with some of the shoreline seaweeds. And I just think that's a really fun example because superficially they look so similar, but they're very different at an evolutionary and cellular level. Okay, so moving on to their ecology. I guess all of that is a very long-winded way of saying that seagrass in many ways is no different to the plants that we have in our gardens. And the garden plant metaphor doesn't stop there. They also grow in beds known as meadows, and they live in shallow coastal waters. They can host hundreds of associated species, whether it be other, well, not other algae, but algae to crabs to dugongs. They are hubs of marine life, much like our garden, really. And here is, I won't go into too much detail, but here is just a really nice map that I found from a paper that shows us the kind of distribution of seagrasses locally, and you can see they're all in very shallow or fairly shallow regions. But near the equator, you've got some crazy diversity, with some individual beds hosting up to 13 different species of seagrass, whereas in temperate waters and the south coast of England, it's usually 1 or 2 Zostera species that you'll encounter on a dive. I don't think I've ever seen 2 in the same place before. So not only do seagrass beds host a diversity of various organisms, they also can sometimes host a diversity of other seagrasses, which is quite fun. Okay, so hopefully that gives you just a broad kind of understanding or backing of what seagrasses are and where they live. And I kind of wanted to then put into perspective how we quantify how important they are. And one way that scientists do this is through the use of ecosystem services. So ecosystem services are the benefits provided by ecosystems that contribute to making human life both possible and worth living. So they can take quite a materialistic approach. It might be down to quantifying the amount of money that they earn in revenue through fisheries, or it can be an intrinsic value that maybe can't be quantified. But when scientists look at the use of an ecosystem and put it into monetary terms, it makes it more useful for things like policy creation, because you can communicate it in a monetary way, and usually that's the language a lot of people want to talk in terms of money. So ecosystem services are a really useful way of understanding how a habitat or animal benefits humans. And I wanted to break down some of the ways that seagrass provide those services for us. So one of the ways that seagrass helps us is by providing flood defense. And they basically reduce force impact of wave action, and they trap sediment. And the evidence of the exact mechanics behind this remained quite scarce for a long time. And it was thought that the actual blades and the canopies of those seagrass leaves were helping kind of mitigate wave action. But it turns out that the roots and the rhizomes are really important, and even beds that have been heavily grazed by manatees or sea turtles and are basically stripped back to their roots with very low biomass are still able to protect us against wave action. So just the roots alone are of great importance for protecting some of the communities, the coastal communities that are vulnerable to flooding. And then from a fisheries perspective, they're also incredibly valuable as nurseries. Fish are at their most vulnerable when they're juveniles, and a nursery habitat provides refuge from predation and may also be valuable as a food source for them. I've observed juvenile seahorses plucking mysids from the water column as they're wrapped around a blade of seagrass. And you can often see at night, especially, lots and lots of small shrimp and plankton are attracted to my video lights, and they'll come into the water column, and especially over the sand, it really feels like a very productive environment to be in. But from a commercial perspective, meta-analysis of juvenile fish living in seagrass documents that fish abundance, growth and survival are greater in seagrass beds than in unstructured habitats. Including the iconic British fish and chips, the species that we harvest for fish and chips is typically Atlantic cod, albeit there is work to try and promote people to eat other species in their fish and chips for sustainability reasons. It's still traditionally cod, Atlantic cod. And the iconic fish in our fish and chips has been found to select seagrass habitat as juveniles over unstructured habitat like sand, and grow faster and have greater survival rates in seagrass beds. But they're also incredibly valuable for a range of coastal communities worldwide for subsistence, whether it be harvesting shellfish and sea cucumbers at spring tide. There's lots of documented cases of coastal communities using seagrass to live, not just for a luxury like fish and chips. And the other one that I think is often really, it's becoming increasingly spoken about now, is blue carbon. So blue carbon refers to carbon sinks or stores within our ocean, and seagrass is being recognised as one that has a disproportionate influence, considering the fact that seagrass beds occupy about 0.1% of the ocean surface, but different estimates range from 10 to 18% of carbon burial in our oceans is stored in seagrass, which is obviously increasingly important given our climate situation. And these stocks are comparable to those of temperate and tropical forests, mangroves, and tidal marshes. So a lot of the hailed carbon stores that we know on land, we know and love on land and get a lot of publicity, have a similar, if not equal, role to seagrasses, but they're not hailed as such with the general public. And there's also this intrinsic value of seagrass. It hosts a wide range of species, and higher species richness and biodiversity is found in seagrasses compared to other unstructured habitats. And that's valuable in itself, right? There doesn't need to always be an economic or materialistic gain. The fact that there are just more species there is worth protecting. And some of the most iconic megafauna that we know and love, whether it be tiger sharks or dugongs, are very important to seagrass habitats around the world. The megafauna that we encounter in the UK is slightly different. We're not blessed with such large animals in seagrass beds, but that doesn't mean they're not charismatic. And obviously I have a bias when it comes to this topic because I dive seagrass beds a lot. They're my favourite, so I can't think of a site that's one of my favourites that doesn't have seagrass in it. But it's not just me that exploits these, it's a lot of different people that have fallen in love with seagrass the way that I have, and it provides a very valuable green/blue space for recreation. So these are some of the photos that I've taken in seagrass. This is not too far from where I live, and most of these, in fact all of these, have been taken in less than 3 meters of water. So while some seagrass beds are deeper than that, the particular beds that we have around the south coast are very shallow indeed. So I've just noticed there's something. Oh, thank you. Yeah, these are some of my favorites that I've taken. So the top left, you're probably thinking that's black. You haven't taken that in seagrass. What on earth are you talking about? But I was taking a photo of, I think it was a nudibranch at the time, and I felt this little sort of buzzing presence around in my periphery, and that's a juvenile bobtail squid. It's the smallest I've ever seen. It's about the size of a thumbnail, and it interacted with me briefly and then shot off into the darkness. And then in the middle we have the black goby. That's the biggest individual I've seen. That's an adult, about 15 centimeters long, and they have these beautiful eyes. I absolutely love capturing that blue hue. They kind of look planetary. And of course, the iconic seahorse. This was my first encounter in the UK. In the UK, seahorses are protected, and flash photography is forbidden by the Marine Management Organisation. So actively finding seahorses to photograph or survey is illegal. However, this was spotted by complete chance, and I took the photo in order to be able to record my sighting with Sea Search, which are an organisation that collect records about marine organisms and habitats to help inform better conservation decisions. And I wasn't quite sure what species this was because it's a juvenile and about 5 centimeters long. This is the one I caught having its late dinner on some mysid shrimp. And then again, we've got a common prawn, and these are kind of staple rock pool species in the UK, the common prawn and the snake lox anemone, very abundant in seagrass habitats. And then the final one is a species of isopod, and one of the kind of overlooked smaller organisms that we see often desperately hanging on to seagrass blades and swaying back and forth. But they've been found to be incredibly useful for primary productivity. They have important grazing roles within seagrass habitats. So I guess another unsung hero of the seagrass bed habitat. Unfortunately, no tiger sharks. Okay, so hopefully from that, it's clear that seagrass beds are complex and valuable ecosystems, and they offer much more than just being a pretty dive site, albeit I do have my biases. I think coral reefs and the vast blue of our oceans probably spring to mind when the average person considers the types of marine habitats that provide food and other services for us. But seagrass is an unsung hero, and it deserves to have its flag waved. So I guess this is, it may come across as a little bit of a diversion to what I'm talking about, but I promise I'm coming back round to a point that's valuable to seagrass habitats. Seagrasses, as I mentioned, aren't particularly kind of well known or valued by the public, and I guess that might mean for selfish reasons that when I rock up at a dive site, seagrass sites aren't typically swarming with divers, but it also means that the public aren't particularly in tune with their true value or engaged with conservation issues that surround them. And I wanted to explain my kind of perspective on that and my experiences with that as a scientist and as a photographer too. And it all started with this card sort activity that I was involved in. My interest in communicating conservation issues and understanding how the public respond to them matches my scientific interest in the marine environment. And I truly believe that half of the value of research is given by how it's communicated to wider audiences. Yeah, this may be a bit of a tangent, but bear with me. Before I started diving and before I started my degree, I went on a short work placement at London Aquarium. And one of the activities I was involved in was this card sort activity that they involved school children and school teachers in. And basically they had a collection of different cards of all different types of marine species on there. There were humpback whales, blue sharks, nudibranchs, cork-wing wrasse. I should have put some photos up now I think about it, but all different species ranging from kind of the grey cod and mackerel to the colourful cork-wing wrasse and nudibranchs. And they asked the students, who were primary school students, and also the teachers, to put these animals into two piles. They wanted them to have one pile of animals that they thought were native to the UK and could be found in our waters, and one pile that were dedicated to tropical species and species that you couldn't find in the UK. And what they found was that anything that was remotely conventionally cute or colourful was put into a species that was found abroad. We don't get those here. And anything that was grey, and I want to say boring because I think that's probably how they're regarded by others, but as a marine biologist, I can't bring myself to call them boring. They were put into the pile of, okay, we find these along our shorelines here. And of course, the grand reveal at the end was that all of the animals within the cards could be found either seasonally or permanently on UK shores. And both the staff and the students were completely blown away by that. But unfortunately, it's not my anecdotes alone that support this kind of notion of the UK just harbouring fairly boring, dull marine life. Public perception surveys show that biodiversity generally is underestimated, and that traditionally charismatic and colourful species are less likely to be associated with UK waters when they're asked. So that might mean, I don't just mean that they're disregarding the big megafauna like blue sharks and humpback whales. They're also looking at animals like the tompot blenny, and they're saying, no, I don't think that's here, it's too pretty. But also plain and less colourful species are more commonly associated with UK waters. So commercial mollusks and cod and things like that are regarded as or viewed as native. And this, I think this really sums it up. I'll try not to hyperbolize too much and be too dramatic here, but when I first read this stat, it really did take me back. I didn't expect, I think when you're involved with a particular topic or a particular habitat, you have this idea that other people will share the same sentiment as you naturally, but that's not the case. And And that's not because they're silly or anything. It's not because they're not listening. I think a lot of the time it's because there just aren't the resources to listen to, especially with UK marine life. So in this survey, 3,000 people in the UK were asked about the seabed beneath their region or off the coast where they visit. And 44% of them considered the seabed generally, mostly, or utterly barren, which is quite a strong, harsh opinion of native sea life. And hopefully, from the photos I've showed you, even just in the last few slides, you can understand that that's not the way it is, especially within seagrass habitats. Okay, so this is where I'm bringing it back to seagrass. I promised I would continue my tangent and get back to seagrass. But this research also looked at how interested people said they were in different species, and also how much they would like to find out more about said species. So things like merle and seagrass were included. Also seahorses, blue sharks, seals, a real range of different species, whether they be plants, seaweed, or marine mammals. And they found that native species with the greatest ecological value, so I'm talking about those ecosystem services like seagrass offers in terms of carbon storage or being a nursery for commercial fish, those kinds of species were ranked as the least interesting. And while 65% of respondents recognised seagrass, they knew what it was, less than 10% listed seagrass as a species they would like to know more about, meaning that it was actually ranked as the least interesting species within the whole of the survey. And this is the photo that I took for the British and Irish Underwater Photography Championship. And I think it really, this imagery of just grass in our seas doesn't inspire. And I think photos like this hopefully give this sense of awe and wonderment for a habitat that is grossly underestimated. And of course, we have the wonderful seahorse within our seagrasses, which interestingly enough was marked as one of the most interesting to the British public and is dependent wholly on seagrass. So there's this real mismatch between the value and kind of use of seagrass and also its just intrinsic beauty and how much the public are really willing to get involved in it. This was something that has only come out in the last few weeks about seagrass, that 92% of UK sorry, I messed that up. Seagrass meadows shrunk by 92% in UK waters. And this estimation was based on looking at habitats around the UK that could be potentially suitable for seagrass to live in, but now no longer have seagrass in, and modelling basically areas where potentially there could be seagrass but no longer is. So these issues that face seagrass are very real and very current, but there's just a real fundamental lack of engagement there. Sorry. So I wanted to sort of explore some of the local conservation issues, because I feel these lessons can be learned, the lessons that can be learned from it apply to any area in the world. But I do apologise that it's not directly linked to global issues at first. I do apologise, I couldn't find a photo demonstrating what I wanted that had any more than 10 pixels. For some reason, every image that demonstrated this phenomenon is really terrible quality, but hopefully it still illustrates it. So locally to me, there are, as I mentioned, lots of different seagrass beds, whether it be in Dorset, in Studland Bay, Weymouth, or some of the areas in Devon, including Plymouth Sound, where I study. And a real topical issue at the moment is the use of mooring chains within and anchoring within seagrass beds, because the mooring chains, as the tide goes in and out, essentially drag along the seagrass beds. And you can see in the photo the patches where the sort of dark colours represent seagrass bed, and the sandy patches represent the dragging of the chains along the seabed, just uprooting seagrass. And it's a very widespread phenomenon that's been happening for a very long time. And yeah, it damages seabed habitat, obviously. But there's a lot of conflict over this because 15 years ago, some local divers discovered seahorses mating within seagrass within about an hour from where I live. And there's a lot of mooring and anchoring going on. And these beds in Studland Bay have been causing a lot of local kind of conflict between stakeholders because they're valued anchoring sites for recreational boats. But we know that it's causing damage. So there's been a lot of work to try and protect these habitats, but it's quite difficult to get people engaged unless they're directly involved. However, we had some good news, I think about 2 days ago now, that one of the sites that I dive locally has just been granted protection and anchoring is now forbidden in that seagrass bed, which is a really amazing step in the right direction. So people are starting to take notice. And on a more, that's obviously very specific to where I live, but there are lots of other threats to seagrass globally. Whether it be land reclamation and light being blocked for growth or set from basically increased sedimentation and blocking out light. Obviously, they're photosynthetic organisms, so they do need light to make their own food. And the likes of fish farming can also increase nutrients, or just runoff generally can create excessive nutrients. And we can see, a bit like how we see with some coral reef systems, a shift from other macro algal species that totally dominate. And there's some interesting work with some of the invasive species going on to see if they are basically swamping out areas where those mooring chains are dragging. And it's creating a better niche for seaweeds to start colonizing and replacing the seagrass habitats. Again, land runoff can also create just general sediment / pollution. But other threats include lack of tools and research to make informed decisions, because there's still a lot we don't know about them. So one of the threats is just our lack of knowledge. And general development will uproot and destroy seagrass as well, probably goes without saying. And lack of awareness. It's harder to pass protection laws if there isn't general backing and engagement with stakeholders and the public. So I think this is where I kind of want to hopefully round up everything that I've said to a message of kind of empowerment, I guess. Something that I really feel strongly about is building connections, because there's evidence from these perception surveys and just from my own experiences that people don't have meaningful connections with the sea habitats around them and the marine animals around them. And they can be 5 minutes from where they live and they may not even know they exist. And personal experience of marine environments has been found to be very important for developing an interest in supporting conservation. And that's been found in people from all sides of the political spectrum, of all ages, that having these hands-on experiences engages people. But with the sea, it's a little bit more difficult because not everyone is going to want to put on a scuba set and start exploring local seabed habitats. But there are so many ways that you can build connections without making someone put on that scuba set, whether it's seeing other people's photos or coming to a talk like this one. And I think Blue Planet 2 really sort of demonstrated that for me. It demonstrated this power of connection and underwater imagery and storytelling. Of course, there was a big budget for that, and you know, there are other stories that we can tell without having a big budget. It inspired people to get involved with things like single-use plastics. Arguably, the plastic problem isn't one of our biggest, but that inspiration that I saw in the general public to stop using a straw or reduced their plastic intake was amazing, just because of really great storytelling. You know, the same goes for climate change, invasive species, habitat fragmentation, destruction, all of these kinds of issues that face habitats like seagrass. I think we can increase engagement through making connections. I think telling people that seagrass is a great carbon storage, or it is a great nursery for commercial fish, is useful. But if they don't recognize what seagrass even is, or feel inspired by what it looks like, I don't know if it's as important or as powerful as we want it to be. The statistics are invaluable, but so is this kind of connection building. And if you're not an underwater photographer, because admittedly that's a very niche thing, you can record what you see. And if you do have records or sightings or anything like that, there are different organisations globally that you can get involved with, and I'll mention that at the end of my talk. And just engage. Again, you don't have to be an underwater photographer or a scientist to engage, and just share an interest. I think everyone, regardless of skill level or kit, has an important role to play here, because everyone has the ability to get excited about marine life and share that excitement with others. And that's really is invaluable. So never feel like you're not capable of doing that because you don't have a camera or a niche knowledge of X, Y, or Z organism. And I think, other than briefly introducing some of these projects for people who want to get involved further, that's kind of where I want to end it. So the Life Recreation Remedies project is run by Natural England at the moment, and they're putting on a range of great events for people to get involved with seagrass. Project Seagrass, you can log seagrass sightings on Seagrass Spotter, which is an app that they have. And that's global. So I know a lot of the examples I've used have been local to the southwest of England, but these are this project is global. So if you have any sightings or kind of you want to know more about other seagrass beds, then check out what they're doing, because it's some really great stuff. And then Sea Search, this is UK based again. They have some great resources, and they can help train you to record the marine life that you see on your dives. But they're also open to snorkelers as well. So you don't have to have a scuba certification. If you just want to be trained in recording what you see on the shoreline, Sea Search are great for that. I hope that this has been insightful. I recognise that it's a bit of a mishmash between the science and then my photos and everything in between. But I hope that gives you kind of my perspective on things and inspires you to get involved more. Because I don't know if you can tell, but I'm slightly besotted with seagrass as a habitat. And I hope that, I hope you enjoy that. And if you've got any questions, either pop them in the chat, or I don't know if you can unmute yourself or what the situation with that is, but hopefully this has been insightful for you. And if you've got any questions, feel free to reach out. You can also reach me on Twitter or by email if you've got any further questions.
Okay. Thank you, Georgie. Thank you. We have some questions. One from I can unmute. I can allow people to be unmuted themselves. Yeah. So we have a question: who monitors land use in marine protected areas?
Thank you for the question. I am not an expert on policy, so I don't want to. Okay, I'll start off with the first question and then I'll move on to the next one. So marine protected areas are a bit of a minefield. The MMO, it depends on where as well. If you're inshore, then, and it depends on what you want to do, but the Marine Management Organisation is often involved in a lot of the seagrass related stuff in the UK, that is. I'm speaking from a very UK centric perspective. For example, with Studland Bay, it's been the Marine Management Organisation and Natural England trying to look at land use within these now protected areas. And most of that is kind of under the remit of the Marine Management Organisation. But if you go offshore, then it it really does vary. Again, I'm not an expert on policy, so I don't want to say anything that's not true. And the next one was, could you please say a bit about seagrasses being replaced by seaweed? What causes this? So I think part of it can be a matter of invasives. I'm speaking from my knowledge. With the sargassum, for example, there's thoughts that the sargassum is kind of blooming at certain times of year and blocking light for the seagrasses, and the sargassum is kind of anchoring itself to the actual seagrass root systems. As I mentioned, they're very dense, so they act as a great anchoring point for other seaweeds. But also the blooming of other nutrients, excessive nutrients, can cause algal blooms as well, which can sort of see the shift from seagrasses to other seaweed species. I'm not a phycologist, so I'm not I'm not 100% on the exact case studies, but I know that there's been some local work on that fairly recently in Plymouth Sound. And Tanya's asked, can I ask if you're aware of how easy it is to seed intertidal Zostera mats to assist re-establishment in comparison to subtidal? In absence of other pressures, where is the research from RE rhizomes' role in reducing wave action and energy, please? So to answer your last question, the Christianen, I believe that's how you pronounce the surname, from 2013, the low canopy seagrass beds still provide important protection services. That was the paper I used for that. So hopefully, if you wanted to explore that later, either write it down, or if you want to contact me, I can send you the link to that. If you have struggle accessing it, I should be able to get you an access copy of that, because I've stored these locally. And I have access through my university. And the other bit about seed intertidal Zostera mats to assist re-establishment. I know there is some really interesting seed re-establishment work going on with the Ocean Conservation Trust. They're the charity that run the National Marine Aquarium in Plymouth, and a guy called Mark Parry is doing some phenomenal work looking at re-establishment of seagrasses and replanting. It's not something I know much about, but I would urge you to look into what they're doing, because I think they'll be much more informative than I am. And Vicky's asked, could beds be transplanted into areas that aren't as impacted by humans? I think I inadvertently just answered part of that, but yes, there's a lot of work at looking at replanting and re-establishing seagrass beds. Ideally, it wouldn't get to that stage and we would protect them before they disappear, but that's becoming increasingly more likely. Cultivation and growing seeds from seeds that have been taken from natives is becoming a very feasible option. And as I said, the Ocean Conservation Trust are doing some fantastic work with that. And what would you like to photograph next? I've made a big list for this year. I've not actually, because of budget restraints being a student, I've not photographed a lot of megafauna at all. In fact, I've not really photographed any megafauna. So I'd really like to get some photos of native seals and some of the bigger shark species in the UK, because they are great at engaging people, and also for selfish reasons, I'd quite like to be in the water with some big animals too. And also some of the smaller species I've just not seen, so I'd like to try and hunt those down and get some nice photos of those as well. Has anyone else got any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat, whatever you're most comfortable with.
Yeah, hi, it's Catherine here. I can put on my video so I can actually put a face to
Hello.
the names. Hi, thank you so much for the talk. That was really interesting.
Oh, thank you.
I just wanted to ask, so I did my postgraduate degree up in St Andrews in Scotland. I'm currently living in Stirling, and I studied ecosystem-based management for marine systems. And we kind of also talked a lot about, different approaches to conservation strategies. So I thought it was really interesting that you also kind of, you made the point that not one sort of approach is going to be the best one, the best fit for everything. But I just wanted to maybe get your thoughts on, see, in an ideal world, you would think that because you have, when you look at sort of certain areas from a marine spatial planning point of view, have a very complex mosaic of different stakeholders being interested. You might have areas that are just really heavy on tourism, you've got infrastructure, you've got fisheries, you've got aquaculture. So ideally you would, or I would argue that, just putting in a protected area is not going to do the deal, because as you say, sort of getting people to connect with these areas is really important, and kind of just doing this outreach work. So do you maybe have some thoughts on, in an ideal world, what would you think is the best approach? What kind of different measurements and strategies you would like to see to kind of find this balance between, yes, protecting seagrass meadows, or, with the anchorage, you named that as one direct impact. Whereas on the other hand, just making the area accessible for people, getting them in, maybe getting them out for snorkeling. Or I'm a diver myself, so I also do quite a bit of work with Sea Search, so I'd be in there all the time basically. But striking that balance between having a really good level of protection while at the same time still making it accessible for people. What are your thoughts on that? What kind of strategies you would like to see to reach that goal?
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate the thorough feedback and also your stance on this, because I've not progressed. I'm still an undergraduate, so it's nice to hear from people that have a different perspective to what I do. I think for me, obviously, I am incredibly biased when it comes to marine imagery, right? Because that's what I do and what I love. Yeah. But I think, for example, I'll focus on the local issue because it's probably what I'm most comfortable giving insight on. That these seagrass areas that are suffering from the anchoring issue, they are technically protected, but they're not. There's no regulation as such to do with the anchoring activity itself. And what's really interesting is that within Portland Harbour, there are these seagrass beds and there is a lot of recreational boating, but the people that use that area are very in touch with the seagrass beds there, because people have become aware through imagery, through local Facebook groups, that there are all sorts of different marine life. So even though there's no regulation saying you can't do that, people don't do it because they know what's there, and they have that connection. Whereas with Studland, there are a lot more users, and a lot of them maybe tourists, or they just don't have that connection or understanding, and there's nothing to tell them that they can't do it. So I think there's this sweet spot between legislation actually supporting what we need to happen, and also the public just being aware that stuff exists. And I don't think this is as much of a problem in some areas as others, because for some communities there's a real dependence on these kinds of marine organisms, so they're obviously aware that they're there and they respect them because of tourism or like commercial fishing or whatever. But with a lot of UK coastal communities, there is like zero connection, and I think that there's a lot of data and evidence for these particular sites. Like, we know things need to change, but there isn't that willpower and inspiration to protect it because people don't really know it's there. So I guess my stance on it is that the research and the policy creation is absolutely vital, but so is that connection. And I think there's like a magic spot between people actually being aware and the policy doing what it needs to do / the research being there. If my dream would to be, I guess, to see the kind of like budgets and documentaries and storytelling that we get for coral reefs and things in the context of like a seagrass bed in Studland Bay, right? Like those kinds of resources dedicated to local marine habitats, I think, could be invaluable. And I know it's not the magic answer to everything, but for some cases, like with the anchoring issue, I think it would make all the difference. I don't know if that answered your question. That's probably more of a rant than an answer.
Yeah, no, thank you.
But hopefully that's useful. And Vicky's asked, best place to dive for seagrass in the UK. There are quite a few places. There's some great sites around Weymouth, around Studland, around Plymouth. There's places in Plymouth like Corsand. I'm trying to think where else. Wrexham in Tall Bay. There are a lot of places around the south coast. If you're ever around the south coast and you want some insight or a dive buddy, do let me know. Just pop me an email or a Twitter message or anything like that. I'm more than happy to help. And yeah, hopefully that's if anyone else has any more questions, go for it. No worries, Vicky, thank you. Perfect, thank you. I really appreciate your kind words. I haven't done anything like this before, so I hope that it wasn't too too chaotic.
Well, thank you very much, Georgie. I think it was like it's really important to have these discussions that that people need to connect with the habitats they want to protect, and I think in practice that's it's like building a bridge between the formal research and the actual public perception and the awareness of the importance of the natural world, really. So yeah, so yep. I think we've got a lot of thank yous for the talk.
Thank you. I really appreciate your kind words, and I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, well, so on that note, I think we can conclude the seminar. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And thank you for joining us from many different time zones, and hope to see you next month.
Yeah, thank you all. It was great to talk to you.